Hi all, I'm Ollie, this is Simply Stitchy. Now what do you do with a sewing machine that you don't want anymore? Or you might not need it because you've upgraded. Well, the easiest way to get rid of it is to sell it on to somebody that will make good use of it. But how exactly do you do that? How do you sell a sewing machine? In today's video I'll take you through the hints and tips for selling a sewing machine. Follow me in. Tip number 1. Know your machine. When you come to sell a sewing machine, you should treat it as though you were selling your car. I mean, you wouldn't dream of putting an ad out saying car for sale. You'd say what it was. You'd say the make and the model, because selling a Dodge Ram or a Ford F350 is a lot different to truck, isn't it? You're giving your potential buyer a lot of information just by telling them the name and the model of what it is that you're trying to sell. And sewing machines are exactly the same. Now, modern machines, like these two behind me, make our lives a lot easier than vintage and antique machines, because they'll tell you what they are. This one is a Janome, and the make and model are on the pillar down here. It's a QC6260. The one behind me is a Brother, and its model is here. It's an SE625. Grandma, bless her, isn't as kind. Although I know she's a singer, because at one point her decals would have said singer across here, and it actually says singer manufacturing company across the top. It doesn't tell me what the model number is. Now, not all vintage or antique sewing machines are difficult to identify. This one, for instance, is a Singer 301A, and not only does it say Singer, but just underneath the Singer badge here it gives you the model number. With this Kenmore, it doesn't tell you what it is on the front, but if you turn it round, just here underneath the thread stand, it will tell you that it's a 158 17 850. Now, whilst it's important to know the make and model of sewing machines, you don't necessarily need to know that this is a Singer 15K80 and that one's the 1591. If you're selling to a collector, the chances are they'll know that this is a 1591 and that's the K80. And if you're selling to somebody who just wants a sewing machine that sews, they're not going to care. All they're going to be interested in is this one's a hand crank and this one's electric. But don't get me wrong, you will score brownie points if you do know that this is the K80 and that's the 91. But all you really need to know is that they're both Singer 15s. Now, you're probably wondering how you can find out if something's a 15 or a 27 when it doesn't actually say on the machine. But there are a couple of websites that you can go and find out what machine you've got. There's the ismax.net website, which has information on all sorts of different vintage and antique machines, and there's also a website specifically aimed at identifying Singer machines called sandmanscollectibles.com, and I'll put a link to both of those in the description box for you. So when you're putting your listing together for your sale of a sewing machine, make sure that you say what it is and you don't just put sewing machine for sale. Tip number 2 when you come to sell a sewing machine is to get your terminology right. There are 4 different descriptive terms that you'll hear when you sell a sewing machine: antique, vintage, retro, rustic. An antique is something of Grandma's age. She's from 1912, so she's over 100 years old, and that's the key. To be an antique, the item, whatever it is, has to be over 100. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't class Grandma as vintage, because you can. The confusion comes into the fact that not everything that's vintage can be classed as antique. Both these Singer 15s are from the 1950s, which means they're vintage, but they're nowhere near old enough to be classed as antiques. To be vintage, an item has to be 20 years old or older, and as I said before, that can include antiques. There is another term that you'll hear quite a lot, and that's retro. Now what retro means is it's something that's new but has been designed to look like something from the past, or it's something from the past that doesn't have any specific value, but a seller thinks, oh, this is old, might be of interest to somebody, so I'll sell it as retro. The difference between retro and antique and vintage is both antique and vintage have got to be old, whereas retro can be new. The last term that you'll hear, rustic. Now rustic usually applies to wooden items, so you might hear this phrase in relation to bentwood cases or sewing machine cabinets, for instance. And basically what it means is the item's got a bit of wear and tear on it, and it's something back home we'd consider as being a bit racked off. It's basically yard art. What you need to make sure is that your description, when you come to list your sewing machine for sale, has the term that best suits your description of it. If it's an antique, call it an antique. If it's vintage, call it vintage. But try to steer clear of rustic or retro, because you might give your potential buyers the wrong message. Unless of course you are selling yard art, in which case, hey, rustic's fine. Tip number 3, find out if it works. Now this Singer 301 doesn't work at the minute, and the reason why it doesn't work is because it's missing a vital piece of equipment. I'll just turn it to face the camera a minute. It doesn't have a bobbin. So until I replace that, this one is a non-working machine. And if you're not able to test your machine for whatever reason, whether it's got parts missing or whether it's because you don't know how to work it, put that in the description that you don't know whether it works or not. Being in working condition brings us neatly on to tip number 4, the condition of the machine. And when I say condition of the machine, I don't just mean the actual sewing head, I mean everything that comes with it, whether it's the bentwood case or the cabinet or table that it's sitting in. Everything that is part of that sewing machine is going to make a difference to its desirability to a buyer. Now, Grandma here she's not in a bad state of repair, she's in working condition, but she has had a hard life, and you can tell at a glance. She's got damage to the shellac, she has damage to the decals, and some turnip put a pin cushion on the arm, and over time the pins have gone through the pin cushion and scratched the shellac off here too. So she's nowhere near mint. But as long as I mention all those faults, if I ever came round to selling her, then a buyer has the best information possible to know whether this is the machine for them. And you have to do the same kind of descriptive process for the table that she's sitting in. This is Grandma's table. It's not too bad. She does have a knob missing. She's a little bit rattly. She wobbles a bit. And although at one point her drawers did lock, they don't anymore. This 301, not only has it got the bobbin missing, it's also got a bent extension table. I don't know if actually you can see that, but it's raised up on one side, which suggests that at some point in the past it was dropped. It's little things like that that you have to bear in mind and mention when you're describing the machine that you're selling. Another thing that a lot of people tend to overlook is the accessories. When these were brand new, they would have come with more than just a foot and a bobbin. This one, for instance, would have had a foot pedal. Now, there is a slight annoying habit for some sellers, particularly on eBay, where they'll separate the machine from things like the bobbin or the foot pedal because they know that they'll get extra money for the bobbin and the foot pedal. The problem with doing that is if you're selling the machine just as the head, you're decreasing the value of the sewing machine because it's not going to work without the bobbin or the foot pedal. The more original accessories that you can provide with the machine that you're trying to sell, the more attractive it's going to be to a buyer. Tip number 5 when you want to sell a sewing machine is you need to make it look as good as possible. So you don't just need a full description explaining all the good and the bad points of your machine. You also need some really good quality pictures. And when you take pictures, you need to make sure you take more than one. And if you are only going to take one, make sure it's not this one. This is the back of the machine. Even those of us who live, breathe, eat, dream about sewing machines are gonna have a hard time trying to guess what this is from looking at the back. When you take pictures of your sewing machine and you've only got room for one, make sure it's the front. The front of the machine will tell a buyer so much more about it. It will tell them the make, the model number, how many stitches it's got. It will say if it's computerised, semi-computerised, manual. You'll be able to tell at a glance if it's got a zigzag or if it's just straight stitch. All of these things help a potential buyer work out if your machine is the one for them. So, as many pictures as possible. If you can only do one, make it the front. Tip number 6. Some buyers, just as if you were selling a car, are going to ask you that dreaded question. They're going to want to know why you're selling it. Now, your reason could possibly be that it was your great Aunt Bessie's and you think it's worth a bob or two and you want to make a quick profit, which is fine. It's a viable reason for wanting to sell something, especially if you can use the money to buy something that you would put to good use. But the buyer's not going to be interested in that. When they ask you, why are you selling the machine, they don't want to know what you want to do with the money. They want to know if there's something wrong with the machine. The easiest way to put their minds at rest is to let them test drive it. Let them see it in action. If you're not a sewist yourself and you don't actually know how to work it, then let your buyer come see it where you are and let them work it. And then they can figure out for themselves if there's something wrong with it. And a better answer to that question is be honest with them and tell them you don't have a need for it. Tip number 7. Where to sell sewing machines. Now, there are a couple of places that you can sell sewing machines, and it doesn't really matter if they're modern machines, vintage machines, antique machines. You can sell any sewing machine in all of these places. You've got a Facebook marketplace, you've got Facebook groups, you've got Craigslist, you've got local ads in your area, you've also got eBay. You do have to watch eBay because eBay isn't particularly cheap to sell items on. You've got all kinds of selling fees, you've got fees that make listings look super fancy, and you've got listing fees that will help your listing get promoted across eBay, so you've got more chance of people seeing what it is that you're selling. You also have final value fees, which is the amount that you have to pay once your item has sold, and all of those costs you have to take into consideration when you're selling your sewing machine. If you do decide to sell your machine on eBay, because you will get a wider audience, then make sure you check the completed or sold listings that are similar to the item that you want to sell, so that you can gauge just how much you're looking at putting it on there for. Which brings us into tip number 8, value. I kind of left this one till last because it can be the one that's most contentious. Sewing machines, vintage sewing machines, antique sewing machines, they're not particularly rare, and regardless of their age, because they were made in their thousands and because so many of them have lasted until now and are still going, they don't have the usual rarity value that most antiques or some vintage items have. Another thing that you've got to consider when it comes to value is where you're actually based. Different locations around the world have different price points for different machines. If we go back to these two Singer 15s, it might demonstrate my point a little bit clearer. This one is the Singer 15K80. Although the decals date to the 1940s, it's actually a machine from 1950. This is the Singer 1591. It's from around about 1952, and this is a US model. This one, the UK model, is a hand crank. The US model is electric, and they're from the same time frame. Hand cranks like this one, even ones slightly older than this one, 10 a penny in the UK. Not so much in the US. Hand cranks are harder to find, which pushes the value up a little bit. Whereas in the US, it's easier to find an electric. They're a bit like hen's teeth in the UK, and that's down to the popularity of the two different types of machines in different parts of the world. And the same is true with models. You might find that you live in an area that has an abundance of Singer 27s, but relatively few Singer 66s, which is going to push the price of the 66 up in your area because they're harder to find. There's no real easy way of telling how much a sewing machine is going to go for in your particular area without checking what similar machines have gone for in your area. Other factors that you need to consider are partly the tips that we've looked at in this video so far. The condition of the machine, the accessories that come with it. If you can have as many of the original attachments as possible, the machine will have a higher value. But having said that, the value is only going to go up so far. Not all sewing machines are going to fetch a high price when you come to sell them. At the moment, the sewing machine that I'm thinking of that does carry a high price is the Singer Featherweight. If you want to know more about Singer Featherweights and how to tell if your sewing machine is a featherweight or a heavyweight, I've got a video on that. I'll put a link in the description box below for you. They are incredibly popular with quilters in particular because they're nice and easy and they can take them to quilting retreats. Other sewing machines, like the Singer 27 for instance, don't have anywhere near the same popularity or value as the featherweight. You're not going to get anywhere near the same kind of price for a Singer 27 or even a Singer 15 that you could possibly get for a featherweight. This Singer 301 isn't worth anywhere near as much as its little sister, the 221 or the 222, the featherweights, even though this is a better machine. At the end of the day, the price that you ask for your sewing machine is entirely up to you, but you do need to be realistic. Being old doesn't necessarily mean it's worth anything. The one thing that you do need to bear in mind when you're setting your price, the sewing machine is only really worth what a buyer is prepared to pay for it. I hope you liked today's video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, and why not check out some of the other videos I've got on my channel at the moment using these links coming up any minute now, or the ones in the description box below for you. And why not subscribe and hit the little bell so that YouTube will let you know when I upload another video. In the meantime, whatever you're sewing it with, embrace your creativity and have fun. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.